Hello, my name is Jackson Presecan, and my project is called Punishing the Outgroup. It is an analysis of Colson Whitehead's The Nickel Boys through Freire's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The Nickel Boys was written by Colson Whitehead, and it is a novel that describes the lives of inmates at the Dozier School for Boys in Central Florida during the Jim Crow era. This school was also called the Nickel Academy. It specifically focuses on the experience of black boys who faced murderous abuse at the school, and it is very accurate to the true conditions that were experienced at this school. I'm analyzing this book through The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which was written by Paulo Freire in the 1960s. He criticized how education was tied to systemic oppression and introduced several relevant ideas about systems of oppression and the dynamic between the oppressed and the oppressors. Paulo Freire developed the pedagogy of the oppressed as a deconstruction of the educational system as well as human society as a whole. He argued that students are not treated as human and educators do not properly consider their needs under current models. This theory is expanded into ideas about systemic oppression within society, the methods used by the oppressors, and the responses demonstrated by the oppressed. The Nickel Boys demonstrates how the structures of oppression laid out by Freire function in the context of a reform school in the Jim Crow South, and reveals how black boys were tortured, murdered, and raped by their oppressors at this school. And a quote by Paulo Freire, which will become relevant later, was when he said, "Washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral." Essentially meaning that acting indifference towards oppression means you're actively participating in it by helping the oppressors. We see a few big examples of false generosity in this book, the biggest one being what Elwood experienced when he first reached the Nickel School. He did all of Mr. Mulcooney's accounting in his head and saw the rudimentary math lesson he experienced as an insult, and one reviewer noted that education at the Nickel Academy is a farce. Where the false generosity comes in was the self-enrichment material that was available at the school. Outdated textbooks in poor condition that were available for students to read. The literature that was provided to the boys evokes for his idea of false generosity, in which oppressors make a show of caring about the oppressed, and he notes that an unjust social order is the permanent font of this generosity, which is nourished by death, despair, and poverty. And we will see plenty of death and despair in this book. The denial of education of these students also echoes Freire's ideas that dehumanization is manifested as an effort to limit how the oppressed themselves experience humanity, as well as being a tactic used by the oppressors. And he stated that dehumanization is a distortion of the vocation of becoming more fully human. Freire theorized that a cycle of oppression forms as the oppressed can often become oppressors themselves, identifying themselves with the oppressors and not recognizing themselves as members of the oppressed class, writing that almost always, during the initial stage of struggle, the oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become oppressors or sub-oppressors. Students and staff at the Nickel Academy continue the cycle of oppression as black boys at the school bully their fellow inmates to fight for dominance and try to come out on top. Black house fathers rule over their charges in the dorm buildings. Some of them endorse or participate in the beatings. For instance, Elwood's house father, who took a more laid-back approach than the school superintendent and, gave him a warm handshake and had a very soft and pleasant personality, was still aware of and not doing anything to stop the abuses at the school, which, referring back to the previous quote made by Freire, shows that he viewed indifference as participation in oppression. One of the most disturbing scenes in the book was the boxing match, which took place between the black and white champions of the Nickel Academy. A character named Griff is the black champion, and he appears as a favorite to win as we watch him fighting his way through the ranks of other black contenders. The fight has a symbolic value to black students who see it as a way to fight against their oppressors. The superintendent, along with other powerful white men, had bet on Griff losing, and he holds a secret meeting with Griff where he threatens him if he does not try to throw the match. However, Griff accidentally won the match, and after this happens, we see him begging Franklin for mercy just after being declared the winner, yelling that he thought it was the second round he had won, not the third round which would have declared him the winner. And we see later on in the book that when the state of Florida dug him up 50 years later, the forensic examiner noted that there were fractures in the wrists and speculated that he had been restrained before he died, in addition to the other violence which was attested by his broken bones. Griff was treated by these men as a tool. The only value they saw in his entire existence was the money that he could have made for them. This complete lack of any empathy or respect towards another human being shows how the black students at Nickel have been completely dehumanized and establishes them as an outgroup to society, which has been defined as a group of individuals toward which members of an in-group harbor a sense of opposition, resistance, or even hatred. The White House is a defining aspect of the Nickel School. It is where boys are tortured, raped, or killed. The way Whitehead writes about the White House is interesting, in that he introduces it and describes it differently than other buildings on the campus. Normally, he will describe a building and simply tell what the functions of it are, so we know what happens. However, the White House is a mystery until Elwood himself is sent there. And a review notes that the White House, Nickel's most recess of horror and violence, is introduced in terms deliberately intended to defamiliarize it through under-lexicalization, basically meaning we don't really know what to expect, and it gives this sense of mystery around the White House. It's also worth noting that it shares a name with the House of the President of the United States, which draws a clear comparison to how conditions within Nickel reflect American culture, just without any filters. And one other student at Nickel told Elwood, "In here and out there are the same, but in here no one has to act fake anymore." Finally, we come to justice in the Jim Crow era, and Whitehead comments on this through not telling us much at all. Because after Elwood is caught riding in the car that had been stolen, despite having been a hitchhiker with no knowledge that any crime had been committed, the story immediately jumps in preparing to leave for Nickel, with barely any mention of a trial. We only get a single sentence in the entire book mentioning the trial, saying that after the judge ordered him to Nickel, Elwood had 3 last nights at home. Whitehead reveals through this that the trial does not matter. Elwood's fate was decided as soon as the car he was riding in got pulled over. Innocence does not matter if a person has dark skin in the Jim Crow South, and the oppressors, powerful white people, seek to punish and vilify black Americans in any way they can. And here are my sources. Thank you.